So good morning, everybody. Good and welcome to this last conference of this series dedicated to Seoul. It's a great pleasure for me to welcome Mrs. Kang Youngji, who is presently a doctoral researcher associated with the Department of Architecture of KU Leuven. More specifically, she's associated with the Raymond Lemaire International Center for Conservation. Our guest speaker today holds a BA and an MA in architecture from the Korea National University of Arts. And she dedicated her MA dissertation on Anglican churches in South Korea. So a topic which is connected with today's presentation, because our presentation today is entitled Starry Crosses in a Growing Metropolis. Which is absolutely related to this series dedicated to Seoul. As usual, we have approximately 1 hour presentation, and then we'll have some time for the Q&A session. So feel free to ask questions to our guest speaker after a presentation. I would like to take this opportunity to remind you that we have the exhibition Mega Still for Decades. You have the catalog is held in Brussels at the Korean Cultural Center, Rue de la Régence. It's free if you want to visit the exhibition. You just have to book a place, book a ticket, but everything is free, and you can find more information on the website of the Korean Cultural Center in Brussels. It is until May the 21st. And I visited yesterday, and I strongly recommend you. It's a collection of pictures, basically, of photos taken by several extremely famous artists, South Korean artists about Seoul. It's very difficult to show you. You have to visit it anyway, and you can see the diversity of Seoul as a city. It's extremely interesting, and it's free, Rue de la Régence in Brussels, in Sablon, until May the 21st. And in fact, this series of webinars is associated with this exhibition. So without any further ado, we'll give the floor to Mrs. Kang Youngji for this presentation. Thank you very much for being with us today, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I would like to share my screen first. Yeah. Can you see it well? Okay. Good morning. Thank you very much for attending this lecture on Catholic Church architecture in late 20th century Seoul. I'm Youngji Kang, and very glad to meet you all through this webinar series. I'm a doctoral student at the KU Leuven and belong to Raymond Lemaire International Center for Conservation as a doctoral researcher. My PhD research is focusing on the history, identity, and heritage of Catholic Church architecture, also in late 20th century Seoul. With some parts of it, an article manuscript about the Catholic territorial strategy of networked parish churches was recently submitted to a journal. A conference paper on architectural discourses on Korean Catholic Church was published. Today's lecture is largely based on these works. The references of presentation content, such as photos and illustrations, can be found at the last slides. For this lecture, I followed copyright guidelines on open online university courses recommended by Korea Education and Research Information Service. The copyright of all presentation contents should be protected, and they cannot be reproduced or distributed without copyright holders' permission. I thank you in advance for your cooperation. So, shall we dive into our journey to Seoul today? I may need to begin with this question. Have you ever seen starry, starry cross neon signs in the sky in Seoul? You would easily find several ones in a few minutes once you look down at the city landscapes. Although Seoul's area is only about 600 square kilometers, only for Catholics, it has 232 parish church communities and their worship places. This means that every 2.6 square kilometers has one Catholic worship space. This number explodes once other Christian denominations such as Protestantism and Anglicanism are considered. It is not that feasible to count the church buildings of all Christian denominations in Seoul due to the complexity of branches within Protestantism, but we can imagine how big the number would be considering a governmental statistics survey in 2016, which reported about 8,500 Christian organizations in Seoul. What makes this phenomenon more remarkable is the fact that around 130 years ago, there was only one church building in this city. Although Korea was one of the last Northeast Asian mission fields, South Korean Christianity prospered substantially after 1953, the end of the Korean War. It attained about 26% of whole population in 1995 and about 28% in 2015. This growth is extraordinary in a country with Buddhist and Confucian roots. Among South Korean Christianity, the Catholic Church reached nearly 8% of the whole population in 1994, particularly among 3 archdioceses and the other 11 dioceses in different cities and provinces. The Archdiocese of Seoul reached almost 9.5% of the population in the area. However, the Archdiocese and South Korean Catholicism in general confronted the limit of high growth from 1994. In 1995, the increasing rate of South Korean Catholics dropped to under 4% and continuously decreased in following years. This heyday of the Catholic Church overlapped with worldwide Catholic Reformation, rapid national economic rise, and Seoul's drastic urban development. Under these multiple historic changes, Catholic church buildings were constructed in the city. Today, we explore Catholic church architecture in Seoul from 1953 to 94, when Seoul was transformed into an international metropolis under multifarious dynamics. How were Catholic churches influenced by the metamorphosis of this capital city in the turbulent era? How did Korean architects and artists develop Catholic church architecture in the city? After looking into why Seoul is an essential city for Korean Catholic mission, we'll see how Catholic church architecture in Seoul evolved in 3 divided research periods. In each period, we'll discover how the urban locations of Catholic churches changed along time and how Korean architects and artists formed their own discourses on church architecture. Then, as a reflection of ongoing church discourses, we'll discuss a representative church project of each period in Seoul. The research material for looking into the urban locations are mainly obtained from my database on current 150 parishes in Seoul, founded until 1994. A parish is a basic unit of the Catholic Church managed by a diocese. A parish governs a village or a town or a neighborhood which has its own church community and priest. My database includes for each parish, the establishment date, past and present addresses, and the completion dates of its church buildings. To observe how Korean architects and artists form their own discourses on church architecture, previous articles of 3 prominent magazines were consulted: Space and Monthly Architecture and Culture, 2 of the oldest Korean magazines on art and architecture, and Gangnam magazine, the oldest Korean Catholic periodical. Catholic mission in Northeast Asia began in Japan and China from the mid-16th century. Joseon, the last Korean dynasty, still remained close to Catholic missionaries and was maintained firmly by Confucianism, the ethical system of Confucius, an ancient Chinese philosopher. Since the early 17th century, Chinese Catholic books written by missionaries introduced Catholicism to Joseon. In the late 18th century, Lee Seung-hoon, a Korean scholar, shortly visited Beijing, China, and was baptized by a foreign missionary. Back to Joseon, he founded the first Korean Catholic community in Seoul. However, the Korean Catholic communities were constantly under persecution by the government due to the incompatibility of Christianity with Confucianism. The France-Korea Treaty of 1886 provided regulatory grounds for Catholic mission in the Joseon dynasty. The government tacitly approved Christian mission work. Most Catholic missionaries were based in Seoul and began to construct their official church buildings in the city. This unofficial religious freedom led to a treaty in 1899, which legally approved Korean Catholic believers. Most Catholic church buildings were on hillsides, clearly indicating their presence to the public. The Yuccan Church, the first church, was built in 1892 in the outside of the city wall. Then the Myeongdong Cathedral was completed in 1898 within the city wall, looking over the royal palace. These churches were designed by a French missionary and adopted some Romanesque and Gothic elements. During the Japanese occupation from 1910 to 45, the church was under the supervision of the colonial government. After the World War II and the liberation of Korea in 1945, the church confronted two contrasting mission fields with the partition of Korea. In North Korea, most priests were arrested and churches closed. In South Korea, Ki Nam-ro, the first Korean bishop ordained in 1942, led local priests and their missionary works. Foreign missionaries were released from custody and returned to their mission places. These two divergent governments' conflict climaxed with the outbreak of the Korean War in 1950. Due to these turbulent political and social situations, only 4 parish church buildings, including the Yuccan Church and Myeongdong Cathedral, were built in Seoul before 1953. Most of them were in and around the walled city in Gangnam, the area north of the Han River. Only one church was located in Gangnam, the area south of the Han River. After Seoul was enlarged across the Han River during the Japanese occupation. The Korean War damaged severely the church both in North and South Korea. However, after the war, South Korean Catholic population grew noticeably for the first time. From 1953 to 62, it was more than tripled thanks to constant ecclesiastical and social restoration works by the church, supported by international Catholic networks. The growth was also based on its higher social and political authority. The Archdiocese of Seoul led the friendly relation between the Catholic Church and the political powers. This bond was encouraged also by local politicians and the US military government. The church strengthened its practical status in the mainstream society, contributing to propagating pro-American and anti-communist ideologies. The US military government's religious policies advocated Protestantism and Catholicism, while suppressing Confucianism, Buddhism, and other folk religions. Syngman Rhee, the first Korean president, inherited these religious principles. Moreover, the Protestant boom since the first Protestant mission in the 1880s by American missionaries brought in synergic benefit to the Catholic Church. Protestantism exceeded 6% of the population already in the 1960s and reversed the social prejudice against Christianity, leading the public to perceive it as a trustworthy religion. This encouraged Catholic laypeople to join mission works too. The Korean Catholic Church's growth led to its rise within the global Catholic Church. In 1962, the Pope proclaimed the official clerical hierarchy be established with autonomy within the Korean Church. This is comparable to other nations. At this time, Seoul became an archdiocese. Meanwhile, industrialization in Seoul was facilitated by governmental economic development plans from 1962. Following population influx caused housing construction for workers. In 1963, the eastern part of current Gangnam was incorporated into Seoul, but not yet developed. From 1953 to 72, that is from the end of the Korean War and just before the urban redevelopment of Seoul, Catholic churches in Seoul began to be designed by Korean architects and built mostly in Gyeongbuk and Western Gangnam, which had relatively longer history and thus more population. The second church construction within each parish appeared in this period, mostly caused by the need for new and bigger worship places. The second church construction projects, however, constituted only about 12% of whole projects, that is 7 out of 57 projects. So in this map, the pink, little pink circles show the first church construction in each spot, and the green triangle symbol represents the second church construction, and the reversed dark green triangle shows the first and second church construction projects in the same site. Korean architects began to be educated in the Japanese colonial era and emerged as the leading actors of urban and architectural projects in post-war South Korea. Because architect Lee Hee-tae had a humble education background compared to mainstream architects, he found clients mostly in the Catholic Church and among private universities. In his early church projects, he cooperated with local Catholic artists. In 1964, he designed the Memorial Church in Cheoltusan Martyr Shrine, located in the Han River side in western Gyeongbuk. This church project was conceived to commemorate the 100th anniversary of martyrdom during Byongin persecution in 1866. The church dedication in 1967 was attended by about 1,000 guests and believers, comprising Yoo Kyung-soo, the First Lady, the chief of the Public Security Agency, and also the Minister of Postal Services at that time. The artworks of this church were directed by a local artist, Kim Se-chung, who himself made main art pieces such as a sculpture in the belfry, the altar, and the tabernacle. The completion of the church in 1967 attracted the magazine Space to firstly spotlight the church building designed by a Korean architect as a main article topic. The church was selected by Space as one of 3 notable architectural projects in 1967 and decorated the December issue with its architectural drawings and photos, followed by an architectural review. However, this church of Lee Hee-tae could not bring about vigorous church projects by local architects in this period in Seoul and also in other regions. Following Lee Hee-tae, other local architects' church designs were covered in Space as main article topics, but each of these articles mostly dealt with only one church project or one architect, and many of them were unconstructed. Besides, their number remained around 10 until 1972. This slow development of early church architecture can be attributed to practical difficulties in church construction and to the lack of interest in quality church architecture. A special feature of Pyongyang magazine in 1971 summarized a discussion about problems ensuing church construction. It was joined by the artist Kim Se-jung, 2 priests, and a lay parish president. These panel members remarked that the existing custom of building churches without professional architects was mostly due to financial shortage and led to inartistic and unsustainable results. Meanwhile, Catholic Artists Union of Seoul, henceforth KAUS, was founded in 1970. This conformed to the new worldwide Catholic trend at the time. The Global Catholic Church held the Second Vatican Council and invited the lay people and lay associations to become the co-workers of the clergy. Following this teaching, the Catholic Lay Apostolate Councils of Korea and Seoul were established both in 1968. KAUS was the first union of Catholic artists in Korea and covered mainly 4 areas of visual arts. The first president of KAUS was Sun-seok Lee, a craftsman who pioneered Korean applied arts. His successor was Kim Se-jung, who led the first generation of Korean contemporary sculpture and directed the artwork of the Memorial Church by Lee Tae. KAUS strived to introduce Catholic sacred art to the Korean public by holding its annual art exhibitions. They also contributed to decorating church buildings with their artworks. Additionally, its members advised the subcommittee for art in the Archdiocese on church architecture and construction. In 1981, KAUS included architecture as its interest field and then recruited 2 architect members for the first time. Through the announcement of redevelopment areas in 1973, Seoul's urban redevelopment was activated by the central and city governments. This was facilitated by 2 political events, a US presidential visit and North and South Korea diplomacy. Seoul government and interested parties visited some foreign precedent cases such as Rockefeller Center, Barbican District, and La Défense, and concluded that economic growth should go with high-rise redevelopment by companies with large capital. Accordingly, major companies led the early projects, purchasing small plots from numerous landlords and then constructing lofty buildings for their business or for their investment. These high-rise projects prospered with rapid economic growth, causing an enormous need for offices. Gangnam's drastic urban development started with the land readjustment project in Myeongdong. This area in eastern Gangnam was designated in 1967 as the highway starting point, linking Seoul with southern cities. Myeongdong received continuous governmental incentives, producing beneficial infrastructures such as new subway lines, express and intercity bus terminals, and large apartment complexes. In addition, land development in Gangbuk was officially prohibited in 1975 to disperse its population and industrial concentration, boosting Gangnam's development. As the population moves to newly developed eastern Gangnam, church buildings began to be built in this area as well. There, about 92% of church projects were the first church construction of newer parishes. Meanwhile, in Gangbuk and Western Gangnam, the proportion of second church construction within each parish was increased. Among whole 56 church projects of this period, second construction projects were 13, forming about 23%. Meanwhile, the Korean Catholic Church began to prepare for the celebration of its 200th anniversary. In 1979, Korean Catholic bishops established a preparatory committee, which later became the Commission for Bicentennial Celebration, with 4 executive committees. KAUS also actively participated in this celebration preparation. Its major members joined the subcommittee for art-related work, which provided designs required for celebration. Particularly, its contribution to Images of the Eternal, an international exhibition of modern religious art, was essential. Its president Kim Se-jung conceived this exhibition to encourage Korean Catholic art to develop in international interactions. He negotiated with European Catholic and governmental organizations to borrow artworks. This admiration for European church art and architecture influenced church architectural discourses within the Catholic Church. Gangnam magazine serialized pictorial articles, which traced back the history of worldwide Catholic Church architecture and selected historic churches and artworks mostly in Europe. The construction of Korean Catholic churches was mostly described as one of principal accomplishments in parish history. In the articles on Jamsil and Jaemulpo churches, church construction was depicted as their first momentous project. Their commitment to the construction was pointed up by the text and photos of female and male parishioners working on church construction sites. Meanwhile, in the mainstream Korean art society, Hee Jun-yu, one of first KAUS architect members, won the Presidential Prize in the National Art Exhibition in 1979 with his church and convent designs. This was reported both by Gangnam magazine and Space. Subsequently, Space noted new Korean churches, mostly designed by well-known Korean architects, such as Myeongdong Cathedral of the Myeongdong Diocese by Kim Soo-geun, the Hangang Catholic Church by Kim Won, and the Cheongdong First Methodist Church by Kim Jong-sik. Monthly Architecture and Culture presented an advanced stage of church architecture discourses through its 2 special sections, mostly on selected churches designed by Korean architects. These sections collectively reviewed several church buildings by different architects and generated an idea or an issue to be discussed further. For example, one of its sections covered 2 Catholic, 2 Protestant, and 1 Anglican churches designed by different local architects. The architectural drawings and pictures showed the difference of each church in design, space composition, and programs, depending on its denomination and urban context. In this growing attention to the church projects of Korean architects, church construction for the bicentenary celebration boomed nationwide in 1983. The Korean Catholic Church opened 1984 in the expectation that its 200th anniversary would be the Holy Year of Salvation with large festivals. The most spectacular event was the visit of Pope John Paul II in May 1984. The Pope led the bicentennial celebration and the canonization of 103 Korean martyrs on the Yeouido Square in Seoul in front of around 1 million believers. The exhibition Images of the Eternal was held in Seoul in the National Museum of Modern and Contemporary Art. About 300 artworks were exhibited, borrowed from the collection of the Vatican Museums, the French Ministries of External Relations and Culture, the Catholic Archdiocese of Cologne, the Roman Germanic Central Museum Mainz, and then from KAUS. For the architecture exhibits, the Catholic Archdiocese of Cologne offered 35 photos printed on aluminum plates, which captured German church architecture during 1965 to 1984. KAUS presented the other two architecture exhibits created by architects Hee Jun-yu and Kang Seok-won. Pyongyang Magazine focused on the artworks of foreign artists in this exhibition. It also reported the bicentennial commemorative exhibition of KAUS alone, which aimed to encourage the development of Korean sacred art and its Korean identity. Space published a special section on images of the Eternal and viewed that this exhibition provided an opportunity for Korean artists to orient themselves in a global context. Its article reviewed German contemporary churches and mentioned that the quantitative expansion of church buildings in South Korea should be reconsidered. Another topic was the maintenance of Catholic religious buildings. The Myeongdong Catholic Cathedral in Seoul was selected as one of the best preserved architectural heritages among initial Western-style buildings in South Korea. The preservation project on the cathedral in the 1980s to commemorate the bicentenary was also discussed. Meanwhile, Monthly Architecture and Culture began a special column on the history of Korean Catholic Church architecture written by Shin Kim. It considered that the most required work at the time of the bicentenary was to organize church history, which would cover church architecture and heritage. It remarked that Catholic churches had a crucial position in the history of national modern architecture, but the relevant research could not proceed due to the lack of empirical materials. The column therefore aimed at introducing churches with significance in times, regions, and styles with photos and architectural drawings based on actual measurement. It also carried a special section on selected Korean churches, which mainly focused on recent Catholic churches designed by local artists and located in Gangnam, Seoul. The notable church building in this period is the second church of Hangang Parish, which was completed in 1980, only about 9 years after the first church construction of the parish, and was highly acclaimed by the local architect societies. It was located in the Han River side in Gangbu and surrounded by newly built apartment complexes along the riverside. Its architect was Kim Won, who won the award of the year 1981 by the Korean Institute of Architects with its church project. It was designed to adjoin the building for a convent and a kindergarten, which had been the previous first church, to avoid legal restrictions. The Korean Institute of Architects appreciated the usage of broken bricks for the outer wall and the steel pipe drows in the worship hall. The L-shaped arrangement of the church building and the previous church building created a small square with a pond and also with a playground for kids. These were for the parishioners, but also for the neighbors around the church from the apartment complexes. Becoming the host of 1986 Asian Games and 1988 Olympics triggered Seoul's revolutionary redevelopment with internationally accepted standards. Until Olympics, 93 areas were developed in the city center. The outskirts were also regenerated, eliminating illegal shanties in the whole city. This radical transformation was supported by subways constructions. 4 lines were built before Olympics to improve traffic flows in Seoul, growing into a highly compacted megacity. 35 years after the war, Seoul's population exceeded 10 million in 1988. A barely known small city metamorphosed into a metropolis. Besides new buildings on rearranged sites with subway networks, the city equipped infrastructures to welcome overseas visitors. Meanwhile, from 1984 to 1994, the rate of increase in Korean Catholic population was about 8.6%. The Catholic Church regarded the bicentennial celebration events as one of major contributors to publicizing Catholicism and thus stimulating rapid growth. In 1989, the successful 44th International Eucharistic Congress in Seoul placed South Korea on the map of the Universal Catholic Church, like the 1988 Summer Olympics of Seoul had contributed to South Korea's worldwide visibility. For the solemn mass celebrated by Pope John Paul II, about 650,000 Catholics from about 100 nations crowded Yeouido Square in Seoul. From 1985 to 94, third church construction was respectively managed by 4 parishes, 3 of which were in Gangbuk. The proportion of second and third church construction within each parish highly increased and accounted for 50% of whole church projects. Still, in eastern Gangnam, where younger parishes converged, first church construction constituted about 91%. In church architectural and art societies, diagnostic discussions on Korean church architecture started to appear. Gangnam magazine noted increasing church construction works due to the Catholic boom, with a section mainly on the problems and solutions relating to church architecture and construction. One of its articles by Jung-Shin Kim, an architecture historian, looked through major issues concerning Korean church architecture in the 1980s. That was such as enormous building sizes, the lack of symbols in interior space, and the need to express national identity with contemporary architecture, as well as the ignorance about church architecture among the clergy, lay leaders, and architects. In his another article, Cho Kwang-ho, a Benedictine priest and painter, suggested that the ideal church architecture should represent the conversation between God and his people rather than the monologue of architects. Space focused on the widespread preference for imitating Gothic style among Catholics. Architect Kim Young-sub viewed that the turbulent Korean history before the end of the Korean War had not allowed enough opportunities to systematically review the style. He stressed that church architecture should use contemporary architectural languages to adapt to the changing spirit of the church in new era. Space also looked through general challenges in Korean Catholic Church architecture with an article which summarized a seminar on Korean church art held by KAUS. In this seminar, Cardinal Stefan Kim Soo-hwan stated that despite the quantitative growth of the Catholic Church, church art and architecture should still be improved to express Korean religious and universal values. Architect Kim Won criticized the chase for large, luxurious, and fast church construction, which resulted in the massive increase of low-quality church buildings. Meanwhile, Monthly Architecture and Culture concluded a special column on the history of Korean Catholic Church architecture. The author described 3 new distinctive features of Catholic Church architecture in the 3rd century of the church, and critically pointed out that positive results were not always guaranteed. The first feature was the massive scale, which would provide 1,000 or more seats for believers. The second one was the adoption of postmodern style to break from the dominant appearance and to harmonize with surroundings. The last feature was the worship space with less hierarchical divisions and the multi-purpose use of church buildings to perform diversified roles in contemporary societies. In another special section addressed the lack of sacred dimension in Korean Protestant and Catholic church buildings. Lee In-young from Gangnam Architecture, an architecture design firm in South Korea, compared Korean Protestant churches with the Korean Catholic churches. And he commented that the latter could retain holiness in a more positive way. He mentioned several Catholic advantages, such as the respect for local traditional culture, the centralized system, and theological changes reflecting the times. The noteworthy church building in this period is Samseongsan Catholic Church in western Gangnam. It is located in Silimdong, a neighborhood surrounded by Gwanak Mountain. In the 1960s, this area became a new habitation for migrants from shanty towns in the old city center in Gangbuk, whose movement was forced by the government. Silimdong had become a popular residential neighborhood for university students and thus people preparing for state exams since the mid-1970s, when Seoul National University moved into this area. Samseongsan Catholic Church was designed by architect Kim Young-sub, who won the Grand Prize in 1988 from Korean Institute of Registered Architects with the Cloister and Church of Sisters of Our Lady of Perpetual Help. This was his debut work, designed in 1980. Through Samseongsan Church, he presented a new design of urban church architecture in 1994. The upper 6 floors are for meeting rooms, a study room, multi-purpose rooms, and also residential places for nuns and priests. This was compressing all the needed spaces on a small plot. Making a worship hall for 600 believers within only 847 square meters was hard to achieve, but the architect made use of the steep slope of the main road. He placed the worship hall on the 2 basement floors and linked it to the ground floor with an exterior staircase. This staircase brings enough light to the worship hall, making it into a more pleasant space. The church is surrounded by apartment buildings and a social welfare facility. The ceiling of this parking lot on the ground floor is lifted up by pillars, making an exterior space which allows the floors above the ground to receive more light to see the mountainside and city skyline around the building. By tracing back how Catholic church buildings spread into Seoul in each period and looking into concurrent urban history, we could discover that their territorial sphere in the city was gradually expanding, following new urban development areas. By this strategy, the Archdiocese of Seoul could respond to new pastoral and missionary needs in newly emerging urban areas where existing and potential believers converged. We also saw that bicentennial celebration of the Korean Catholic Church developed the styles, distinctiveness, and influence of national church architectural discourses. The bicentennial celebration facilitated new church projects by creating the commemorative church construction boom and by publicizing Catholicism. More church-built projects brought more elaborate methods for generating discourses, such as comparing multiple church designs of different architects or denominations, or addressing common challenges and solutions in church architecture. Furthermore, the bicentennial celebration encouraged the authors and readers of Korean church architectural discourses to reflect on national identity in church art and architecture. The commemorative international art exhibition enabled them to view the works of Korean artists and architects in international perspective, while the commemorative exhibition of cows expressed the effort to develop national identity. The roots of church architecture were also explored through the special column on the history of Korean Catholic Church architecture. Additionally, the bicentennial celebration allowed the church architectural discourses to affirm its specific significance in general Korean architecture. The special column on the history of Korean Catholic Church architecture stated the essential position of its topic in national modern architectural history, and the commemorative heritage preservation work on the Myeongdong Cathedral made the building an exemplar case of early Western style architectural heritage in Seoul. This growing architectural influence of Catholic churches in Seoul was thanks to some Korean architects who became main actors in church projects after the Korean War, including Lee Hee-tae, Kim Won, and Kim Young-suk. Although church construction was not a major or popular project, but a new field to be pioneered in most time of the research period, they stood against practical difficulties such as negligence from major architect suckers, the custom of locusts and easy church construction, and stubborn Gothic preference within the church. Their attempts to develop quality church architecture could succeed due to the commitment of local Catholic artists in Seoul working in union. 1994 was a traditional year both for the city and the Church of Seoul. To celebrate the 600th anniversary as a capital, the Seoul city implemented commemoration projects for improving Seoul as a historical and sustainable city. This reversed the previous development-oriented pursuit. As a main architectural project, the government demolished apartment buildings on a mountainside to retrieve the old mountain views and create a public park. The explosion was live broadcasted with citizens' acclamation. The Archdiocese also faced its mass growth limitations. Although the Catholic population was still expanding, its rate began to fall. Dormant and unidentified believers increased, and the proportion of the believers aged 65 or over started to rise steeply. In October 1994, the Memorial Church in Joseon Martyr Shrine was given the Space-Time Award 25 by the Space Group of the architect Kim Soo-gun. He was one of the legendary architects in Korea in modern times. In a review in Space, a jury member highly appreciated the work of his architect, Lee Hee-tae, and his comment was against Lee Hee-tae's previous reputation that considered him as a marginal architect. This reveals that by 1994, the appreciation of Korean church architecture was developed sufficiently enough to generate a new perspective which would challenge a prevalent view in general architectural discourses. Founded on the achievements of the first generation of Korean church architecture, local architects and artists have been working continuously to create new church architecture suitable for contemporary Seoul, exploring Korean identity and responding to the new needs of the society. The development progress of Catholic Church architecture in Seoul reflected the growing status of the Catholic Church and Seoul city. It also revealed inevitable issues following their rise, as well as ideas to deal with relevant challenges. Looking into its evolvement, therefore, could be useful to the Korean Catholic Church in this generation and other Christian denominations and even other religions and their institutions for predicting how religious prosperity could affect their 21st century religious art and architecture. Based on these anticipations, they could prepare short-term and long-term plans for conceiving, adapting, and promoting their sacred architecture. Information on references can be found in these slides, or you can contact me for more information. And thanks a lot for listening and joining this lecture. And to a new and clumsy scholar as I am, your interest on my research indeed has encouraged me a lot. And here is my contact. It would be a great delight if we could communicate further. I send you sincere gratitude. Thank you.
Thank you very much, dear Youngji, for this very interesting presentation.